So hi everybody. About 3 years ago, I was involved with the Silicon Valley company, the goal of which was to build the Google of 3D search. So for this, we were doing this large kind of assessment of what 3D models were available on the internet, looking at different ways to search them, shape-based searching, different kind of tags, that kind of thing. The company went bankrupt pretty quick, but I had this large data set of all these 3D models on the internet, and I decided to spin this off into a research project. So, why should librarians care about 3D models? You know, we catalog books, sometimes music and films. Why 3D models? So 2-3 years ago, there was this thing called makerspaces that were popular at the time. The idea was you'd get people together in a space to make things. The real big selling point of these makerspaces that you saw come around was 3D printing. Usually when a place opened up a makerspace, if they called it a makerspace, sometimes it was just a 3D printing service, sometimes a hacker space. These 3D print 3D models. And anyone who's been around 3D printers in a library knows the question that comes up very commonly is, I don't know how to do 3D models. How do I do 3D models? Where can I get them? Which led to this question of where do we get 3D models from? If you don't believe me, ALA has done a ton of news recently on 3D printers and libraries, rapid growth, copyright issues. Like it or not, libraries are becoming very tied to 3D printing. At the same time, more recently, there's been a lot of progress around virtual reality technology. This is an older Oculus Rift, but we see the HTC Vive is coming out now. A lot of really cool new products coming out in virtual reality, getting integrated into universities, even some public libraries. At the same time, there's a lot of work in augmented reality. So a similar idea to virtual reality, you put on your augmented reality headset. Instead of kind of putting you into a virtual world, augmented reality will take the 3D models and project them in the physical space. The big example that's being demoed right now is the Microsoft HoloLens you'll see. Just an example, my friends at the University of Oklahoma Libraries recently opened up a virtual reality kind of innovation lab featuring a lot of this AR, VR technology, proven to be very, very popular. More and more at McGill especially, I'm seeing professors integrate this into their classes and their labs, becoming more common in education. The other one, sorry for the gross picture, I can only find one image, but this is called haptic technology. So the other way with haptic technology, similar idea too, it's often used in conjunction with VR, AR technology, but those things the guy's holding onto there actually lets you feel a 3D model. So you're using something like surgery, where as you move those sensors, it can feel the surface of a 3D model, giving another level of interactivity. A lot of experimentation with that in regards to education, surgery training, also for students at a much younger age. Coming out, there's this new movement coming through called open hardware, another big one. It's very much tied into the open software movement, but taking a step further. So not only are people opening up their source code, but the actual designs themselves. So usually you can download this package file, a bunch of STL files, they're called 3D printable models. You 3D print this out. They come with a spec sheet like order these circuit boards, order these screws, order this. You can get it off Amazon or any electronic supply store, put it together. You can start working with the technology as well as the software. The one big example that was getting a lot of press was these open source guns, defense distributed. Actually, the only gun you can get in Canada that Trudeau won't make you register. But this was getting a lot of bad press a couple years ago. It's kind of quieted down, but that was one of the first early examples. People are open sourcing, improving firearms. Less violent examples, there's this Poppy, an open or affordable humanoid robot. This is completely open, so if you have a younger student or anyone interested in robotics, you could download all the schematics for this, print out the parts, buy the circuits, put this together, and there's some demo source code. So if you're interested in robotics, it kind of gives you this soft start. You don't have to worry about building a robot yourself. Here's how to get started. Here's how you write some codes to move its arm. So it's a really nice soft start to get into this kind of thing. Other examples in prosthetics, open source prosthetic hands, same kind of idea. Anyone interested in getting it started with prosthetic work, here's the freely downloadable 3D printable models, here's the electronic components you need, here's the instructions for assembling it. It's a couple weeks project for someone decently experienced. Also in relation to 3D models, there's more and more work in reverse engineering. The 3D scanning technology compared to 3D printing is still fairly expensive, but more and more we're seeing these applications being brought to use. There's more 3D models being generated every day. Smithsonian Institute especially is doing this in regards to heritage preservation. The issue right now is that it's a very time-consuming, expensive process. So while the Smithsonian and a few other museums have had large grants to do this, it takes weeks, if not months, to do a high-quality 3D scan of these. So the actual development has been fairly slow. So what I wanted to talk about today was just a brief history of 3D models on the internet and just an overview of the state they exist in today. So I have three different eras I'm looking at. The first era I kind of call the education and discovery era. It's 1992 to 2005, though you can find examples all the way back to the 1980s. The very, very first example you start seeing this through was through the VRML. If you aren't familiar with that, that's the virtual reality modeling language. It was a type of early HTML scripting language that let you port 3D graphics to the web. At the time, there's a lot of interest in this. There's a talk of this 3D web. We're going to get off 2D websites. We're going to have these crazy 3D worlds. And a lot of people were just openly sharing these VRML models and code all over the internet. Even libraries and museums were getting into that. This is a very early 90s example of a 3D museum through VRML. It's crazy because today you hear a lot of people saying like, oh, Oculus Rift, we could have virtual museum walkthroughs. People have been doing this for almost 20, 30 years at this point. The idea has been there for a very long time. Also coming out through the early 90s, Stanford University did this digital Michelangelo project where they laser scanned the statue of David, as well as a lot of other art objects. Really important at the time because it showed people this type of 3D scanning was possible. But the other thing they did was they opened up all their scans, all the versions of the scans, cleaned and uncleaned on their website, freely downloadable by any other researchers. So you could go and read their paper, but you also had full access to the 3D models, and there's a lot of research spun off of this. At the same time, there's a lot of websites, a lot of people were interested in 3D modeling in terms of gaming and animation, and they were just sharing the models. You can see here you go download thousands of 3D models, come and download them. A lot of people freely sharing their work, encouraging other people to get into it. If you were a programmer, but you needed 3D models to work with, they're just openly shared with each other. Places like the Georgia Institute of Technology developed a large geometric models archive. So they noticed they're doing a lot of intensive graphics research, and a lot of the 3D models they were finding at the time were extremely small. They were trying to test more powerful computers. So they pulled together a free archive of models. At the time were very large, but of the range to 1 to 5 megabytes that would test the kind of limits of the machines for other researchers. But yeah, the main point at this time, all these models were being shared for free. They were very experimental, and the main purpose behind them was just to educate others, to help others research, and it was a larger kind of community effort. Around 2005, there's this emergence of more of like a marketplace era, where as these are getting more popular, people start seeing an opportunity to commercialize in the 3D model space. There's an important distinction to make between CAD models and animation models. The main thing to note is CAD models are designed for a purpose. It's kind of functional design. I need somewhere to sit, so I make a chair. Where you have this functional purpose, whereas animation can be entertainment, it's for movies. There's no like functional purpose in real life really behind them. In the CAD sphere, we start having these sites like TraceParse pops up, offering millions of CAD models. ThomasNet is another one, does a very similar thing. You can see we have these adapters, adjusters, boxes, all these very generic, simple CAD parts. It kind of streamlines the engineering process. So if you're developing something, you need to build these CAD models. It's a quick way out. So instead of having your very high-paid engineers do all this tedious design work, you could download some common models, pay for them cheaply, and work on the more significant parts. And here you see an example, and also they could be 3D printed rapid prototypes, thing called CNC machining. You needed a part quick, you could order them very quick through these websites. But the point behind it was that you're paying for these models rather than just downloading them for free. In the animation sphere, you had companies like TurboSquid pop up. These companies are still around today. So they were seeing all these 3D models being shared openly for animators and that kind of thing, and they weren't happy with the quality. They're like, well, we're gonna get some real designers, some real high-end models, and we're gonna charge you for them. Another website like CG Trader popped up with the same thing. You could see on the side that these models at the time, again, like 2000, going for $100, $78, different categories, like you'd have vehicles, hospitals, aerospace, that kind of thing. So you had access to these designs, very high quality designs, professional quality, but you started seeing that there's fairly high price tags attached to them. But again, an example, a designer, this is a very simple game that was made. Anyone programming before could go and get these free models and plug them into a game they're programming with. With the rise of CG Trader and Turbo Squid, it became more of an issue that you're paying for it. Much like buying stock photography, you're doing a simple game. I needed like a bad guy and like a character to throw into my game. You'd be paying, you know, like $80 or $100 to throw them into your game, compared to before where it'd be fairly easy to find this for free. So lastly is the 3D printing era. For those kind of new to it, 3D printing's been around for a long time, since the late 70s, invented by Charles Hall, who spun out a company called 3D Systems. Eventually there came two companies to dominate it, 3D Systems and Stratasys. The machines got better and better till the very advanced industrial machines you see today that are capable of some very like Terminator-like production methods. It's very cool, very advanced. The issue with all this 3D printing was that it was not cheap. Mid-range, again, you're looking at 20,000 for the most basic, up to 100,000 easily. And the high range, we're getting up to 2,000 plus. When you get into 3D printers capable of metal, you can hit the millions. So this was very, very limited. And really the only people at the time who were touching 3D printing technology were engineers really trained in it. Everyone else outside of academia, when you left school, you probably never see this again. So as a result of this, there's a guy named Dr. Adrian Boyer out of the University of Bath who started something called the RepRap project. So the RepRap project was to open up 3D printing and kind of make it accessible to people. So it's this larger open hardware project where he tried to turn this, like the high-end, you know, $500,000 machine, into something that you can make for a couple $100. Almost looks like it was made out of Connect or something like that. But again, it was able to do 3D printing. The big issue you come up to is this is professional quality 3D printing. This is a lot of what you see in promotional materials when salesmen come around to your library showing you 3D prints. This is what you see. I have a lot of librarians, like this is made on a, you know, like a $50,000, $100,000 machine. Librarians spend $2,000 on the first 3D printer, fire it up. Typically that's what you get. And like, if you're experienced with 3D printers, like that's 90% of your 3D printing. To get one to look like that, it's a lot of work, and every model is different. So we have this RepRap printer, very early iterations, and that's around, you know, like 2005-ish. Over time, it starts to improve. We see this MakerBot company comes out, I'm sure you've heard of, that starts getting more efficient designs. This is an earlier model where Thingomatic, where they've replaced a lot of that rough Connect-looking frame with an actual wood box. It's getting more professional, still very hobbyist, kit-based, but it's getting nicer. And then, of course, you see like the sleeker $2,000 to $5,000 machine sold today by MakerBot and its hundreds of competitors. At the same time, MakerBot also released a site called Thingiverse. This is where it's very, very early days. So the point to Thingiverse was very much like the early 90s era of 3D models, where it was just 3D printing was really new. It was a very hobby group, and people were building these 3D printers, these RepRaps, and they were just looking for models to print. So at this time, Thingiverse had maybe 80 models of it, very low quality. You could see their featured model there was like a cup a guy made at Mega. And so it's just like people were desperate at the time. Like a lot of guys, they're like engineers, they're kind of hardware guys building printers. They didn't really have time to figure out 3D design software. They didn't care. So they're just looking for models to get their hands on. The other big thing was models you could compare your prints against. You could tune things and see if you could get the prints to come out nicer, but you had access to the same stuff. But again, all free, all being shared openly, very big hobby community around it. MakerBot, of course, gets sleeker and sleeker to its current era. The collection begins to grow. It starts getting more corporate. At the same time, this other site came out. GrabCAD is kind of like an in-between site. It's very engineering-based, very CAD-based, but they've kind of angled themselves into 3D printing. So I'd say at this point, Thingiverse has the largest collection of 3D printable models. GrabCAD's like a distant second. Really focused on the CAD side, but again, all their models are 3D printable. Every CAD file will convert to a 3D printable file. More recently, you're seeing a lot of startups pop up. My Mini Factory is a big one. So much like CG Trader and Turbo Squid came up for the 3D animation models, these companies are saying like, okay, Thingiverse has too many models. Most of them aren't very good quality. We're going to start releasing higher end ones. We're going to release corporate models, professional designs, but we're going to charge people money for it. We're going to charge them a couple $100s for these designs to download. The other interesting spin-offs you're getting with 3D printing is companies like Shapeways. So they don't sell the 3D models, they sell the 3D printed iterations of the models. But again, it's a cost-based. People upload their 3D models. If other people like them, they don't pay for the model itself, but they paid for the 3D printed version. So this is the other unique spin-off you're seeing of 3D printing. So just looking at how many 3D models are actually online, why should we care? There's billions of CAD models, but it's very difficult to measure. So these sites like ThomasNet and TraceParts, they have very simple CAD models, but you could down them, like they have automation for different sizes, so I can enter height, length, different dimensions, and it'll automatically generate it. So there's just so many different iterations, the number of models just shoots up. The very small selection of core models, and they tend to be very like functional specific parts like bearings, that kind of thing, less important designs, and it's hard to assess the historic value, and I think most things of historic value aren't online. So things to think about, this is a CAD model of a NASA space rover. There's tons of famous car designs, NASA designs. A lot of these started as CAD files, either sitting somewhere on a computer, maybe. No one really knows what's happening to them. Nobody knows what's going to them. But there's this large, very significant CAD design that is just not being cataloged, not being preserved. Same thing in architecture. Like a lot of these modern buildings start off in CAD programs being designed. No one really knows what's happening with these CAD files. A lot of architecture firms I've talked to have them on their computer, but there's no real terms of storing them for longevity. And the other issue is as these files get out of date, there's no way to access them. If you try accessing a 20-year-old CAD file, it's going to be extremely difficult. Other ways to think about it too, we have the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts has a whole collection of just the progression of interior design for furniture, that kind of thing. And again, these are all stored as CAD files. If the actual physical product deteriorates, the CAD file gives us a record of how it was created, how it was functioned, and allows for this replication of these products. In terms of 3D models, again, millions of 3D models, tons of 3D artists out there, tons of 3D video games and movies. A lot of it is very low quality, just people experimenting and putting stuff out there. But things to think about too, like there's a lot of like, it's Elsa from Frozen, but there's a lot of movies, 3D movies coming out where the movies themselves are preserved, but the actual files that go behind them, the 3D models being developed, there's no methods behind this to preserve this or think about if there's something we want to preserve. Same with video games. The early video games going back to the 90s, like early ID software games like Quake and Doom, there's huge communities around here, not only generating code, but models. And like people catalog this, people collect it, people have it preserved online in these like niche community groups, but there's no consensus among them about how to do this, how to preserve it. So you have these like very weird, obscure pockets kept up by hobbyists with no real way to communicate with each other, no way to standardize it. It's about 5 million 3D printable models, but just widely varying quality. The thing to note is that many of these CAD models out there can be very easily converted to a 3D printable format, but they tend to be, again, more functional parts. It's not always easy to do. For animation-related models, it's much more difficult. It's not easy to download a model from CG Trader, like a Smurf or whatever kind of 3D figure you have in Elsa, and convert it to a 3D model or 3D printable model, a bit more work. The problem with 3D printed models, I call it like the waving octopus theory, but it's like you see these like kind of like gimmicky 3D print models. The other one you see is like there's like some cat models, but it's these kind of like token models that get out there and they get reworked. So you always see these with like the first things you 3D print. You get a 3D printer, you print the waving octopus, but then there's all these like people like, oh, I'll put a top hat on the octopus, I'll put some glasses on them, and you get the spirals out until you get like of the 5 million printable models, 1 million are variations of the waving octopus. We get lost in this like. So this is just looking at the free 3D printable, the graph of how they've grown. The red line will show you GrabCAD's growth since 2012, and the bluer line up top is Thingiverse. So you can see during like peak 3D printing was probably 2013 to 2015. That's when everyone was getting into it, and you see it just explode. So GrabCAD goes slower, the growth is much slower, and even now at like 2015, it's really starting to level off at around 150,000 models. The site's like they're very misleading about the size of their collection. You'll see them throw out like 2 million models online, but it's just like the same versions of the same model in different file formats. Like they'll count every single file format in one model. If one model consists of 20 pieces, they'll count every piece as individual models. Thingiverse, you'll see like skyrockets between 2013 and 2015, but even now it's starting to level off too. And just going through it, you'll see a lot of models that get added. It's a lot of people's like first 3D models. Like I designed my name in SketchUp, here's a name tag, they put it up there. But looking at the actual quality professional design models, they're much more difficult to find. So one thing I did when I had this database of 3D models, I collected metadata information in terms of like the description, the user-generated tags, the titles, and I just compared that for like a EBSCO breakdown for the different subject keywords for biology, chemistry, that kind of thing, just to see how many hit that with like the title of the tags for educational subject disciplines. Engineering and architecture is just, they're so high you can't even compare them. I didn't even conclude this in this. So there's tons, if you work in architecture, engineering, there's tons of models out there for you. In terms of other fields, you could see historical recreations and scans. It's about 6,000, seem to be like the really definite area where there's work being done. In terms of biology, that was second, in middle place for people doing biology-related models. And then kind of closer to the end, you saw chemistry, mathematics-related models, medical, at the very bottom, physics and geography. I'm thinking a lot of these are just user-generated titles and tags, so I have no idea whether or not they're actually accurate information, the quality of it, especially with the historically created cameras and recreations. I don't know like how usable it would be. Some of them are very rough 3D models that have been tagged with this, so the actual number is probably even lower than that. But overall, you can see like if you're buying a 3D printer to open up the possibilities of education to students, outside of like instructional programs teaching them how to design on a 3D printer, the actual content available is very, very small. This is a breakdown of licenses on Thingiverse. So I'm just trying to see how people are sharing these models openly. You'll see by far for the Creative Commons attribution share alike is still like the dominant license. Next to that, just attribution. So people are sharing these fairly openly. Attribution non-commercial is the third. Attribution non-commercial is at the very end. So by far the top 4 license all allow you to kind of freely download and rework the model as long as you're giving proper attribution. And looking overall, the number of free models versus paywalled models. In terms of 3D printing at least, the majority does seem to be free at this point, where pay models, while they're significant, the amount of free content does seem to be overwhelmingly there for this point. The issue now is recently, so as I said, there is Stratasys 3D Systems, these big 3D printing companies that people tried to get away from. So RepRap project opened up to take this technology away from this exclusivity, give it to everybody. RepRap kind of built into MakerBot, and then MakerBot was recently purchased by Stratasys. So we've kind of taken it full circle. We've gone from this community open source program, now we're back to these big corporate companies owning all the patents again. The same thing that Stratasys did when they did this was that they own now MakerBot's Thingiverse, and they also bought GrabCAD at the same time. So this puts by far the vast collection of 3D printable models under the control of one of these larger 3D printing companies. So shortly after Stratasys did this, there's a big story that came out that when you upload a 3D model, the Thingiverse MakerBot kind of claims ownership on the model. And very shortly after Stratasys bought this, there's claims that MakerBot had taken user-generated designs on their 3D printers meant to improve it and filed patents based on that information. So there's a lot of community backlash in regards to just like, you're taking our intellectual property, you told us this was a free open community, this is open hardware, we're all developing, and now you're patenting this and kind of making money off of us. So a big backlash in this regards, but there's little people can do. In terms of 3D scanning, there is a lot of corporate interest going in the background, but quietly. As I said, Smithsonian, which is more open and generous with the 3D models, is doing this work, but slowly, it's very grant dependent. I've heard from backstories, though they haven't promoted it a lot, that the Google Cultural Institute actually has their own 3D scanner now and is actively partnering with museums to do a lot of 3D scanning. Hasn't really released a lot of it, but that is going on. And there's the Emerald Cultural Institute that's done a bit of work in the background on this too. So at the same time that like libraries and educations are investing more into this, you see some work on the corporate side actually focusing more on the content of like making these historical museum items that would be of value kind of available through their own proprietary systems. So just looking at, should we be archiving 3D models? Should we be thinking about this? An issue with the current state is there really isn't one. There's no, as far as I know, in terms of like 3D model standardization, categorization, archiving, there's just nothing out there. And for a lot of the companies I know generating 3D models, you talk to any like video game studio like in Montreal, if I talk to like, they make 3D models constantly, but they just tend to sit in a computer. There's no real storage process. There's no archival process. Same with engineering firms, architecture firms, government. They're out there, they're being developed, but there's no standards in place to preserve them. There's a lot of challenges with preservation as well. Proprietary file formats, some are free, but a lot of proprietary where they're not easy to like maintain over time. Extremely large file sizes, so if we're trying to keep these over time, they get into gigabytes. Like when you deal with 3D scans, the raw scan data will easily get into gigabytes, it can be tens of gigabytes. If you're trying to catalog thousands or tens of thousands of these, you need a serious, expensive amount of space. And then the last issue is changing technologies. A lot of the 3D design technology is changing. The file formats are harder to access. When 15, 20 years go by, I think a lot of these CAD files that are out there could just easily be lost and inaccessible. But so the issue is now we have these maker spaces, we have all this technology, and I think I recently see a lot of articles regarding 3D printing where at this point makerspace or MakerBot is essentially abandoning the home market. You know, there's this big upswing between 2013, 2015 where 3D printing companies were doing very good, stock was shooting up, and it was all through these $2,000 to $5,000 printers. And the main people who were buying them, it turns out, when all the numbers come in, were libraries and universities. So we have these now, like we're the ones who bought them. It was a big sales pitch to get it through. At McGill at this point, I think they're sitting in faculty offices right across campus. It was a very easy purchase for a grant. If you could throw some 3D printing to the grant, you buy a 3D printer, print your one thing, now it sits in an office. They're sitting in libraries. You know, and I think the main experience people have is you buy these, you try 3D printing something, you 3D print your waving octopus, but very slowly the value of it kind of starts to fade. I think the same thing getting into virtual reality, augmented reality technology. Like I just found out 2 days ago, McGill's given me a bunch of money to start getting into more of this augmented virtual reality technology. So we have this one space, Research Commons space, we do a lot of data visualization. We have a data visualization wall, that kind of thing. We're gonna bring in some HTC Vive headsets. We're gonna bring in some Microsoft HoloLens. We're getting into this, but it puts me in the position where in terms of contact, where in terms of like making this usable, I'm reaching out to faculty, I'm trying to discover what faculty are doing that can relate to this. And outside of this like faculty-generated 3D model research, just finding applications. Like at this point, it is not easy to develop 3D models. It's a very steep learning curve. It takes talent. It's kind of like program. You can show someone to program, but unless they kind of have a natural ability towards it or some kind of talent towards it, it gets very frustrating very quickly. And like I'm one of those people. I can't 3D model. I've tried to do it. It's just not for me. But I just constantly get this question where people are looking for 3D content. We're providing these tools to people, and when they're coming to us to use it, outside of like pushing them towards software and telling them to learn it, there's no real, nothing we can really give them to help. So my main point on this was just delivery versus content. I think libraries at this point have been very focused on the delivery, the technology itself. So we've been buying 3D printers, we've been buying virtual reality headsets, I'm starting to see it, but there's been no real focus on the content we're providing. And like at this point, I've been putting 3D printers in libraries for 6 years. Should libraries be doing 3D printing? At this point, I don't think so. Like if it gets people into your library, it's a good thing, but the amount of time I spend in a week fixing a 3D printer, changing parts, that kind of thing, like it's a huge amount of time. And I mean, like I see it set up, like outside of libraries, especially on university campuses, I see makerspaces set it up. I see engineering departments set it up. They're paying engineering students to do this more efficiently, who have the time to go in and fix these things. It's a huge amount of time to maintain. But it's just we've focused on this technology. The technology sells. The technology gets the people into the libraries. But I'm just worried long term how this technology is going to be integrated. We just have very little to offer users outside of the technology itself. Like here it is. Here you go. Have fun. But what you can use for it, it's not there yet. My other concern is in terms of 3D models too, like, again, the ebook issue, that we're relying Like the big ones relied on right now is Thingiverse. There's a couple other free sources of 3D models, but there's no guarantee at all that this is going to remain free. And as people become more dependent on that, like Google especially, if they come out with a lot of 3D scan models and they make a proprietary system, if Emerald does, these could be very expensive packages. And if we're offering 3D printing, virtual reality, anything like that, but we're stuck paying for 3D content, we're stuck paying for historical scans, historic models, it'll be another very difficult situation. I also want to do a plug for my friend Patty. If you're downtown Fredericton, the Chef Piece Patisserie and Cafe. So Chef Patty's worked in some of the best restaurants all over the world. From New Brunswick, recently moved back to be closer from her family, right beside City Hall downtown. Actually, when I was a teenager, I worked underneath Patty, and she used to tell me, she's like, if you can't learn to listen and follow directions, you'll never make it as a chef. And now I'm a librarian. But so recently voted one of the 10 best bakeries in Canada by Huffington Post. If you're downtown, check it out. Any questions?
Closer. Questions? Yep.
I had to look it up, but the Grande Bibliothèque in Montreal for Nuit Blanche this year did installation that was really tech heavy with the virtual reality, and you walk through that space. Yeah. Could you share your thoughts on that, or if you were
I think it was
aware of
more of like a demonstration piece to bring people into the library.
Yeah, it was like an art installation.
Yeah, it's a nice event. It brings people in. It's one of those technologies for libraries that I think it's like attractive to people. People hear that, they want to come in and see it. It's new, it's exciting. And I think it's a good way to get into the space. My concern is just like when you make that a permanent thing, the actual work in maintaining it over time, it's just hugely staff intensive. And I don't know long term if it is maintainable.
I have a quick question about the file formats. I was just looking up how many file formats there are, and you were saying that many of them are proprietary.
Right.
Down the road, do you think that there will be standard open formats that people can use for preservation to make sure that these files are accessible long term?
I don't think so anytime soon. The problem is like it's very proprietary software that engineers use. There's like Solid Edge, but they all have their own proprietary software formats, but they're by far the best technology. And it's the same thing with animation. You have free programs like Blender, which they're effective, you can use them, it's all open source. But then there's the very like professional, like 3D Studio Max that the professionals are using. And I think as long as they're using those really expensive lockdown technologies, the open formats won't be strong enough to take over like that.
Thanks, that was a great talk. I've really limited experience with any of this, but it did make me think of Dan O'Donnell's team working on the Visionary Cross project at Lethbridge, doing the Ruthwell Cross. It's this amazing imaging of it, and I mean the data sets are insane. The normal mapping is like in the terabytes, and so I was just thinking, you know, storage of that, preservation of that, it is going to be. Do you intersect with any of those kind of like DH large projects?
Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it's just a thing of money. How like server space is expensive, storage space is expensive, so it's a huge time commitment, huge money commitment for space. But so if the funding's there, otherwise, you know, it's very hard to deal with.
Anybody else? While I'm at the back of the room. All right, thanks, Mike.
Thank you.